Who am I? Well, you know who I am. I've been going to school here for 4 years. So instead of talking about me as a person from the last 4 years, we'll talk about what I'm looking into doing in the future, which I'm sure you also have an idea of, but you got to hit this point because it's on the rubric. I am planning on majoring in psychology at K-State, where I'll also take some undergrad classes in pre-medicine so that I can then move to med school with KU, and I'm hoping to get in at either Salina or Wichita because it's a little closer to home. And then after residency, I want to come back and work here in Sterling. And we did the math a few months ago, and Dr. Decker is going to be getting ready to retire by the time I'll be getting done with med school. So it'd be it's like a God sign, I guess. Motivations for the project. There were two main motivations for it. The first and biggest was that the accident, Jake going home, and that was, I really wanted to tell his story somehow, and so this was kind of my way of being able to do that. And then the other part of things was that I loved writing and have discovered that I'm rather talented at it, not to pat myself on the back, but I really enjoy it, and your classes are what kind of taught me that I loved to write so much, and especially loved descriptive writing. And so that's where the kind of motivations came from, and that is what led to my essential question, which was how do effective authors hook and keep their readers' attention? Because probably the biggest concern that I had with thinking about writing a book and then actually writing it was that you want your readers to enjoy the book as they're reading it, and you don't want to bore them. So the most important thing to me was to get not only get Jake's story across, but then also get it across in a way that was interesting enough that they would tell other people so that other people would hear his story. So yeah, there's the essential question. And that led to my 9 guiding questions, which I looked through my research paper, was able to answer them. Where do I publish my book? How much would it cost to publish my book? How much would I have to sell the book for in order to break even? After the book's been published, how long will it take for the first shipment to arrive? Who should I have proofread my book prior to publishing? How long should my proofreaders have to proof? Should I proofread as well, or just leave it up to my proofreaders? How many chapters should each proofreader have, and should the book be proofed as I write or after I've finished writing? And through my research paper, I was able to answer many of these questions for myself, and some of them were, especially the bottom 5, were more preference-based type things. After researching, there wasn't a whole lot of articles that would say, okay, this is the better way to do it. It's more of a preference deal when it comes to answering those questions. But when it comes to the publishing aspect of things and selling the book, that was something that was answered through the research from the research paper. The purpose, which we've kind of already talked about from the beginning, I chose to write it because I've always wanted to write a book. As I was talking about at the very beginning, I thought about writing one freshman year and had started to write it, but then never really got around to finishing that. And then I also needed to tell my brother's story, and so that was kind of the purpose behind the book. And then we also kind of talked about how I arrived at the essential question, and that it needs interestingness, if that is even a word, is important when writing a book, because you need to keep things interesting for your readers. So then the research. Probably something that I found the most interesting was one of the major trends with fictional Christian literature, and it's that the desire from our society to read religious and specifically Christian literature is growing. And it's grown quite a lot in the last several years, and one of the articles that I found for my research paper actually talked about how in, I think it was 2014, religious literature was the 3rd highest selling in terms of profits out of any other any genre of literature, and it's because people have been desiring Christian type books, fictional Christian books. And so that was something that was really important to me as I was writing, because this book, in order for it to convey the hope that my family feels, it needed to have some sort of Christian overtone and undertone as well to things. And so I needed to see what the popularity was of a fictional Christian book. And so then, how did my sources help answer the essential and guiding questions? As I was talking about earlier, kind of each source took care of a question, and then those last 5 again were ones that I was able to answer on my own based off of preference, and then based off of how much my proofreaders could handle.
Can I ask a question before?
Yeah.
Did you wrestle with the question of what makes a story Christian?
Not really. I've read a lot, which is another reason. The type of reading that I read is similar to what I wrote. And a lot of the books that I've read, especially the last couple of years, were by a guy named Brandon Sanderson, who is a Christian and has a lot of Christian overtones and undertones in his books. And so that's something that kind of inspired me to make sure that I got a whole bunch of Christian-based references in the book. So there are references to God in that book, and there are references to Jesus in that book, and that Jesus came and saved everybody, and there are references to heaven in that book. So I made sure that was in there, because that was something that was really important to me. And if I didn't, to answer the question, I didn't really have to wrestle with it too much. I just had an idea in my head of this is what I was wanting when it came to portraying the Christian side of things.
Because it's an interesting question when you get into it deeper. I guess I would suggest looking into that, because I think it's worth talking about. So just as a plug, maybe I'll suggest it.
Okay. So now for the project and kind of the process. First, I had to kind of decide on a topic for the book. So like I already knew I was going to tell my brother's story, and as I said, I already had that prologue, the first version of the prologue previously written. And so I went ahead and went with that first version of the prologue, which dealt with a game that my brothers and I would play, a board game that we would play a lot when we were younger. And it was actually the day before the accident, Jake and I finished that game for the first time. It's a really long game, and so you get it set up and you play it for 2 or 3 days, really hardcore, and then you get busy, and then it'd sit out for 3 weeks when nobody would do anything with it, and one of us would go, let's just pick it up, we're gonna be done with it. So it was neat that we actually were able to finish that the day before the accident, and so I decided to kind of model some of the characters after characters in that game. And so that was kind of where the topic came from, and the aspect of the warring factions in the Wellspring War. Then the next process, which was something that I kind of found out through the researching that I did, was that you need to outline a book next, because it helps stop writer's block from happening. It kind of causes writer's block as you're outlining, but on a smaller scale, if that makes sense. When I had tried writing before and I'd stopped, it was because I had reached a point where I didn't know what I was doing next, and that is what caused the problem of writer's block and why I didn't write for 3 years. But because of the outline, I would have points where I'd be like, I don't know what I want to do next, and so then I'd be able to come up with ideas and go, okay, well this will be the next big point that happens. And so in that notebook there, in between you guys, is actually my outline. It's like the third section of that notebook. It's also got a whole bunch of loose papers in it. But I went through and I wrote down a lot of specifics on some of the characters that I used, as well as characters that I came up with and didn't use. And then I came up with settings in there. I came up with each chapter had its own little outline, like this is what's going to happen in this chapter. And as I went through writing, I discovered that there were some areas of those chapters that would go better if they had been combined with another chapter, and other chapters that I had outlined that I decided didn't really go with the message of what I was trying to get across. So the original outline had a total of 60 chapters that I was going to write, and the final product for the book is around 42 chapters, because I'd combined enough and cut other chapters that weren't really necessary for the book. So then I guess that's kind of the writing portion of things too, is as I was writing, I would go through and change the outline some based off of ideas that I would generate while I was writing, which meant that what you see in the outline isn't exactly what's in the book, because I did change things as I was writing those chapters from what was in the outline. Then the next part of the process was having the book proofed, which is vital to writing any sort of book that you actually want to be published. And so when it came to proofing, I decided that I was going to use, I shouldn't they use, 2 people to help proof my book. One of them was my mother, because she was at home and very reliable and is a good writer and even an author herself. So I figured that she would be a pretty good person to read my book. And then the other person that I had proof things for me was my mother's mother, because she had proofread my mother's book when my mom was writing, and she's very grammatically sound and really, really, really fast at proofing. The process, what I decided on, kind of like those guiding questions that we're talking about, how much should I give them to proofread at a time, how long should I give them? What I decided to do was I was going to write one part of the book, so like the first part, and then I'd give it to them to proofread while I was writing the next part. And I would attach that document that had the part in it and email it to my grandma, because she lives in Oklahoma, and she would, by the end of the day, send back a proofed copy of it. I would send it to her about 10 in the morning, usually, and then before I went to bed that night, I'd get an email from her that already had it completely proofed. So she was really fast and really good, because she caught a lot of things. It was kind of interesting to see the differences in what my mother caught versus what my grandmother caught. And there were times where they would both catch the same thing, and then times where one would catch something that the other would miss. And so it was kind of neat to see that. And not to say that one of them was better than the other, but they were just, it was nice to have multiple people look at it, aside from my own eyes, because as the author, I kind of knew what was going to happen, and it's one of those things where your brain skips over errors because it already knows what's coming. Then came the editing process, and at this point I took about a week after I had finished writing and started going through. I got both copies of the manuscript out, the one that I'd given to my mother and the one that had been emailed back to me from my grandma. I got both of them out and started going through making corrections on the document that I had on my Google Docs. And that took about a week and a half to go through and make all of those changes. And pretty much every free moment I had in school during that time was devoted to just getting that part of things done, so that I could get to the next part of publishing it, which was the uploading. I decided to go through lulu.com with self-publishing, because that's what my mother had used, and she said that it was really good. And as I was looking at things, I liked the way that Lulu did things more than some of the other self-publishing websites that I had looked at. So when it came to self-publishing it through Lulu, the first step was to download a template for the size of book that I was wanting. So I had to download that template and then upload my own document into that template. And at that point, that was also when I wrote the dedication, the preface, the acknowledgments, those sorts of things. And that was also, then once I was done with that, I'd upload that template back into the website and then continued on with the process. Towards the end of it was where the covers came into play, and the front back covers, and those were actually done by my mom, because she knows Microsoft Publisher a lot better than I do. And so she did a lot of the cover design type stuff for me, which I'm super grateful for. And so then after that came the actual publishing part of things, which with self-publishing, even though you use a certain website like lulu.com, they aren't technically considered the publishers. That's why it's called self-publishing. They make it really clear in their document that they give you as kind of a template that you are the publisher. So when it says write the publisher down, you write your own name as the publisher. They're just simply a printing and distributing company. So then I was able to publish it. And one of the perks about Lulu, which is one of the reasons that I went through Lulu for publishing, was that they have a sort of a global distribution aspect to them. Once you have published your book and you've received your first copy, you can send your books through global reach, is what they call it. And what that does is it puts your book on 3 pretty big websites when it comes to books: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Ingram. And Amazon is actually, according to the stuff that I got from my research, Amazon is where you want your book more than anywhere else, because you're going to sell more copies on Amazon than you will anywhere else, thanks to all of the users who bought this also bought, or users who viewed this also viewed. So then it gets it more publicity and more people buy it through Amazon. And so that was one of the major factors, was that I wanted to be able to get as many copies as I could sold, so that as many people could read the story as possible. And so with Amazon, that was super helpful, and that was one of the great parts about using Lulu. And then finally came the ordering process. My mom, when she ordered her book, it took a couple to 3 weeks to get here, and so I had I'd set a date about 3 weeks before today, so that I would order it and then they would be able to get here beforehand. But because I was able to get everything done with the publishing aspect of things faster, I was actually able to order 2 or 3 weeks ahead of that deadline that I'd set for myself. And so by the time I got to that deadline, I'd already received my first shipment of 24 books. And then because of books that I'd given out to people and then selling the books, I actually about ran out of that shipment, so I was able to order another one. So I've got about 15 books sitting at home right now that are there because the ordering was a lot faster than I thought it was going to be. So that was kind of another nice aspect of Hulu. Or maybe we're going to do that. Now for kind of the high points and low points of the project. The high points I'm going to focus more on things that worked really well for me while I was writing. The first was wordless music. I'm someone who needs to have something going on, like musically, in order for me to really focus on something. And so when I first started writing, I kind of experimented with what kind of music was going to work best for me when it came to writing. And so I discovered that wordless music was super helpful, whether that was club music or just ambient tones that are going on in my headphones. Those types of music were what allowed me to focus more on the story and didn't distract me from what I was doing. Something else that really helped me was seclusion, and this is something that every author will tell you is super helpful. There were times where I would try and write while I had a friend spending the night, or while my family was watching TV, and so I would try and hang out with the family some, because oftentimes the process of writing for me was I would get up, I'd go to school, then I'd go to basketball practice, then I'd go home and work on homework, and then I'd write until I went to bed. And so I wanted to make sure that there was that family time where I could be with my family. So there were nights where I would try and write in the same room as my family, but those nights it was a lot harder for me to write because I'd be writing, and then I would get distracted by something that was going on. And then I'd go back to writing, but I'd forget what I'd written about previously. So I had to go reread that, and then I'd type 2 or 3 words and get distracted again. So seclusion was really helpful when it came to getting the book written. And then another thing that was really helpful, like I talked about earlier, was outlining each chapter, because since I was writing a chapter a day, what I could do is I could say, okay, this is the outline for today. So I'd read that outline, and then I would be able to just write. I didn't have to worry about what it was that was going to come, because after I had read that outline, I knew what I was going to be writing about for that specific chapter. And had I not done that, it would have been a lot harder to write each chapter. So now for some low points. The first one was kind of the working in front of the TV or working around other people, like I talked about, and another one was music with lyrics. If it had a lot of lyrics in it and I knew the song well, my first inclination would be to sing to it. And when I started singing, I would forget how to write, it seemed like. And that would kind of sacrifice the message a little bit, which is something that I didn't want to have happen in a book where the entire purpose of me writing this was to get a message across to people. And then one more low point that I understand was needed for this project, but did cause some problems for me, was having a deadline on the final product. Because of having to get it done in a certain period of time so that I could then get it ordered and get it all here for this today, there were days where I didn't really feel like writing because I'd been writing for 20 or 30 days and I was ready to have a break from writing, but I couldn't take a break because I needed to get it written. And so there were days where I struggled with sacrificing the message of each chapter just because I wanted to get it done because I was tired of writing. And so having that deadline was probably the biggest problem for me when it came to actually writing. And so if I were to do it again, or write another book, as I'm thinking about writing another one in the future, since I enjoy it so much, my biggest thing is I'm going to make sure I don't have time constraints. I know a lot of authors will say, well, this is the day that I'm planning on releasing this book. But if I become a big author, which is unlikely, I would not have one of those deadlines where I would say, okay, here's when I'm expecting to release the next book. I'm going to just write, and whenever it gets released is when it's going to be released, because I don't want to sacrifice the message in any book rather than getting out there at a certain period of time. So now we can move on to the exit portfolio, which I have here. In there I've got the letter of introduction, I've got my resume, and then I've got 7 artifacts ranging from assignments that I had in your classes, which was funny. I planned on using them before I found out that you guys were going to be my jurors, and then found out, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I put my favorite paper from one of your classes in there and my favorite paper from your class in there as papers that I was going to, as artifacts that I was going to put in there. And then after the artifacts, I kind of had a letter of closer. I had contact information in there just because there's the potential that I might use this in the future as something. So if you guys want to take a look at that now, you can. If you want, I can continue with the presentation. I can take you through artifacts if you want.
Just tell us what your 5 are and why.
Okay. So as we're going through here, my first one is a calculus test that I took in October, but it's not your average calculus test because I got a C on it. I put this in here. It's the only grade I got below a B all year in calculus, but the reason that I put this artifact in there was because when I got that C, it was like getting hit in the solar plexus. I lost all the wind in my sails immediately because I've never struggled with math before. And this was the first sign that I had struggled with math and calculus. And so what I did was I took this test and I inserted it in my calculus book, whatever our next lesson was going to be. So when I came in here and I opened up my calculus book, that was the first thing I saw, and it was my motivation to do better. And so I didn't get below an A for the rest of the year on any of my calculus tests because of this. Then the next thing that I put in there was my exceptional academic award for my ACT. This is more of kind of an academic focus type of thing, just because this is an award that not every student gets. Having to get a 32 on the ACT in order to achieve this award, I figured it was something that was rather important and I should go ahead and include in a portfolio of some of my best works. The next one is The Battles of the Unseen, which was the short story that I wrote in English 2, and it was really the first story that I wrote that I really discovered that I enjoyed writing and loved writing it so much, descriptive writing. If I were to go back and rewrite the story, I'm sure there are plenty of areas where I would write things much differently because I'm a different writer now, but this was the kind of the first paper that I wrote and the first artifact of the papers that I wrote for your classes. Then the next one, my fourth artifact was the Little Red Truck, and it was the Memories in a Glass Case paper that you had us write at the end. I think it was the end of at the end of Catcher. And so I included this one because it was almost my I consider it more of my warm-up into getting into my book because I wrote this and then like the next week started writing, started the process of beginning to write my book, and so it was kind of a warm-up for me. But it also takes a lot of memories of what I had with Jake and a lot of memories that I had with Jake, and even talks about the accident itself in it, and so that was just an important story, and so I made sure to include it. Then I included the 2 state choir certificates that I got for being a member of state choir. Not every singer in the state gets to be included in it, and not every singer in the state gets to be included twice. So, and since singing is something that I really enjoy and have a passion for, I decided to include it. The 6th artifact was my Boys State certificate. This is something that I included because not everybody that applies for Boys State gets into Boys State. I don't remember how many it was that we had applied for starting. I think we just had 4 of us, is that right, Will? And all 4 of us made it in, but there's only a total of 500 senior boys across the state that make it into Boys State. And so it's something that's based off of your grades. And it was also something that kind of changed the way I had an outlook on our government because it was such a heavily government-driven aspect of things. And then the last artifact that I included was the encouragement award that I won that I got at the basketball banquet, which is this award here. And I included it because this was the first year that they had that award with the basketball team, and it was kind of it was meaningful to me that I was the first one to get it, and to me it showed that even though I was having a rough year, I was still seen as someone who was able to encourage other people through my time on the floor, whether that was in practice or in a game. And so that was something that I decided I wanted to include as my last artifact. And then the contact information in the back and closure letter. So there's kind of the aspects there. All right. So now the final word. What seeds has this project sown for my future? Probably the biggest thing is it has sown the seed of writing as a hobby for me. I enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed the descriptiveness of, like, I enjoyed descriptive papers, but because of this project, I've discovered that I really, really enjoy writing, and it's even something that I am able to connect with God with. It's something that kind of allows me to blow off a little bit of steam as I'm writing, and so writing as a hobby is something that definitely came from this project. Who have I become as a person, and a person who learns? 3 big things came out of this project for me when it came to who I became. The first was that I became a better time manager, the second was that I became stronger, and then the third was that I became more disciplined. And because I had to have this written at a certain point, I became a better time manager with what I did, because as I talked about before, my day went from waking up to practice, to homework, to writing, and then back to bed. And so I had to be really good at managing my time, because I wanted to get as much sleep as I could during basketball season so that I was ready to play when I needed to play. And that also taught me how to be more disciplined, because, like I said, there were days where I didn't want to write, and days where I would much rather have done something other than writing. But because I needed to get it done, I had to be disciplined enough to get it done. And then finally, it made me a stronger person, because after 2 or 3 weeks of school, practice, homework, writing, school, practice, homework, writing, it starts to wear on you. And especially since it was the middle of basketball season and the middle of my senior year, there were a lot of things going on in my life. And so having to write a book was also piling on top of that, which caused a lot of stress. And so this project made me a stronger person because of it. So now kind of just my final thoughts and what makes me me. High school has been a great experience. It's been the best 4 years of my life. I loved junior high, but when I came in as a freshman to high school, I didn't know what to expect. And I've changed a lot since that little wide-eyed freshman walked through those doors 4 years ago. I told myself I wasn't going to cry.
I've heard this every hour. But
Yeah. I've learned through high school and through events with the accident, I've learned how to love people unconditionally and how to put other people above myself. I've learned how to walk down the halls with a smile and care for other people. I've learned how to be myself. In junior high and as a freshman, I struggled a lot with who I was as a person, because I didn't enjoy being judged. No one does. And I've discovered from high school that it's okay to be the weird me that I am, because if I'm not me, no one is. So I need to be me. And I learned how to be a gray person. When I entered high school, I was very, very black and white. Betsy can attest to this, as she and I had a conversation about how I felt like all Democrats should burn in hell as a freshman. And I've since grown past that. I've learned to be more gray. I'm not as much of a black and white person, or right and wrong person. I see that there are gray areas now. I've learned that there are great Democrats in this world, and that there are people who are Republicans that have problems. So it's not like there's not a right and wrong side. Another thing that happened, I never thought that I would ever be able to tolerate, much less be friends with a homosexual, and Solomon and I ended up being great friends by the time he graduated. And that was just 2 years into my high school experience. And then the final change was that I learned that being right isn't always what's most important. And that's another big thing that I learned from the accident. In the past, I've always been somebody who, being right is super important, and if you're wrong, I'm going to make sure that you know what's right so that you're right as well. And I learned from the accident and from high school that sometimes it's more important to just love people and let them be wrong, because it's not really that important if you're right when things come down to it. So that's kind of the end of the presentation. Got any questions, I'd be more than willing to answer them.
How about you, juniors? Do you guys have any questions on the first and Anderson? I want you to do one thing, whether it be now or later. Okay, the research that you did on writing this book, how did it inform the essential question? Answer that a little more clearly. Yes, you learned about publication dates and all that kind of thing. Did you you learn from authors, like certain things? What you do?
A lot of what I read from my research talked about there are certain, you want to make sure that you know what your target audience is. And when you're writing, you want to also write like an author that you really respect. And so those are, from my research, those were the two biggest points that kind of talked about how to make your book interesting and make it something that's worth being read. Because you need to know what it is that your target audience wants to read. And then something that I read that was talking about how it would make it easier for writing is if you take a look at one of your authors that you like to read the most and see their writing style, that it helps because that's someone who's interesting, someone who is a bestseller. And so if you write in a similar style to that, it's going to be more interesting, and you're going to be happier with the product because it's similar to that. And so this book was written a lot like the way Brandon Sanderson writes his books, because during the time prior to the accident as well as up until I started writing, I pretty much read only his works. And so that was, and it's because he's just an amazing author. And so I was able to kind of mimic some of the ways that he would write things because I'd read so much of his writing. It helped me make my book a little more interesting because of it.
And I think a lot of people say that same thing about young writers. That they find their rhythms based on what they enjoy.
And yeah, and one of the authors that I found an article about was saying, for my research paper, she was saying that she was going to write a series of poems about a tragic event that had happened in her life, but she didn't know how to actually start writing it, because when she started writing, she felt like it was boring. And so one of the things that she had read was that same sort of thing, where you go and you read works that you really like and then kind of model what it is that you are wanting after that. And so then she kind of provided an excerpt from a series of poems that she had read, and then followed it with an excerpt of some of the poems that she had written. And you could tell that there were similarities in the way that things had been written, because she had gone through and said, okay, this is kind of how they did this. I really liked that, so this is how I'm going to kind of do it.
And if you would write more, JJ, you would eventually find your own style
Right.
involved, but you have to start somewhere.
Right.
Did you read anything about inspiration versus discipline? I mean, you talked about, like, you read enough authors hear them talk about writing. Authors will say different things. So some will say, I was really inspired to write this particular story, and this is how inspiration hits me. And then you hear other people say, well, I can't write because I'm not inspired.
Right.
And then you'll hear authors say things like, well, you have to be more disciplined. Did you do some reading about that? Find some stuff about?
Didn't do a whole lot of reading on inspiration and discipline. Really, some of the articles that I read that talked about setting up a book and preparing to write a book was when you're choosing your topic, find something that inspires you or something that's one of your passions. And so you can write about that, because your best writing is going to come from something that is inspiring to you, or something that you're the most passionate about. Because when you're trying to write about something that's not that interesting to you, it's not going to be a very interesting work, because you don't really want to be writing it.
Yeah.
And I didn't really find anything on being more disciplined. I think that for me, the most that I learned about being disciplined just came from having to get it written in a month-and-a-half time span. So
maybe that's my next question, which is, do you have another story that you need to tell? Because you said at the very beginning, you had something that you needed to tell. And that's very different from saying, I just want to tell the story.
right.
And so I get, another thing you said was, you don't want time constraints.
Mhm.
But like, you can't, I guess you can't fully answer this, but my question is, do you think that you'll be able to do what you did without the time constraint, and maybe without as deep of a desire to need to tell it?
I think I probably could. I'm someone who, when I get an idea in my head, I go 100% until I've got it done. And so that would be one of those things where if I get another story in my head that I want to tell, even without time constraints, I'm going to get it done because it's a story that I want to tell, and while that's still in there, I'm going to have to do something about it. So that's, I guess that kind of answers that question, I think. So.
Juniors, any questions? Why did you help them, JJ? You're a very disciplined person. Would you do Everfi or Commons first, or would you do your research paper first? How would you do that in terms of?
All right. So, like I said, I had to be really, really, really careful how I managed my time with this project because I had to get a book written, and that takes a long time. So, the part of what you have to do for your proposal next year, when you propose what your project idea is going to be, is you have to include a timeline for Mr. Richter. And I suggest being as detailed as you can possibly be with that timeline, and then not just throwing the timeline away. In the past, if I hadn't had to be as disciplined about getting this done, I would be one of those seniors that would give the timeline to Mr. Richter because I had to give it to him, and then I toss it out the window as soon as he gives it back to me because I'm not someone who really works on a timeline. But this is one of those instances where you really want to stick to that timeline because there are so many things aside from just your project that you have to get done, like your research paper and things like Everfi and Commons. You have to get those done. And so then when it comes to actually getting them done, I would say do the research paper first. That's going to take the longest of the three things other than your senior project. The research paper is going to take the longest, and Mrs. Cruz loves it when you're the first person to turn in your paper. So, I mean, like most of the other students hadn't even had an idea of what it was that they were going to do for their project yet, and I'd already turned my first draft of my research paper into Mrs. Cruz. And then she was able to grade it and give it back to me real fast so I could make corrections and then turn it into the final product within a week's time frame. Then I would suggest moving to probably Commons. That's the easier and faster of the two Everfi type things that you have to do, but it also lets you get your feet under you when it comes to using the technology of Everfi. It's something that if you, like, as I was noticing going through the actual Everfi part of things with those modules, the actual Everfi, the financial lit portion of things is a little bit longer, and you kind of have to know what you're doing with the Everfi program before you really have an idea of what's going on in the financial lit. And Commons is like a really good warm-up for it. It's kind of your civics stuff, so you already know a lot of what is in Commons because you've done civics since you've been in school. And so you know a lot of the answers to a lot of the questions that are posed there, and so it gives you a chance to not so much focus on the material, but more focus on the mechanics of the website. So I would go Commons and then financial literacy. And during that time frame, make sure if you've got a project that is going to take a long time, like writing a book, if you can, do it at the same time that you're doing Commons type stuff. And it's something, if your project is something that you do outside of school, then any time that you have in school, devote it to doing your the other portions of your senior project class when you're not working on homework for classes that's forced to do beforehand. So I guess that's the best I can think to explain those sorts of things.
Other things, juniors, that you'd like to know? Obviously, he advocates for doing something you're passionate about, because that means that a lot.
Oh yeah. And Mr. Richter does a good job of making sure, like when you're kind of coming up with ideas for your project, he has a little worksheet that you do that says, okay, what are the 3 things that you enjoy most during your free time? And so then you list those 3 things out, and then you start brainstorming ideas that involve those 3 things, so that you can have something that you already kind of like doing before you actually start your project.
I'm just impressed that you completed it. It's impressive. It really is.
There was after I turned in my research paper for the last time, Mrs. Cruz came in. I was kind of working on Commons, and Mrs. Cruz came into Mr. Richter's room and said, "So you said you wanted to write a book, but I just want to let you know that we've had students say this in the past and not complete it, and I don't want you to like jump headlong into this and then not get it done and then have to have a bad presentation about this." And that was kind of one of those things that was a challenge to me almost. And I'm not someone who backs down from a challenge. So
she just knew what you needed to hear.
Yeah, I think so.
And that you were capable of love that.
Yeah.
We've honestly had people write a book and they come up with a chapter.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, so. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, JJ. If anybody wants to look at his notebook, come see the awards, come see the book. If you haven't seen the book, please.
Yeah,
do.
and if you want to come look at this, I think Mr. Richter is allowing, I heard somebody say that he was allowing the use of a website type of thing for your portfolio next year, just because that's what you guys are doing in Mr. Votes' room right now. But if you do, if you like this kind more, feel free to come take a look at it as I'm getting things taken care of to put things away, just so you can generate ideas of what stuff needs to look like.
Good job, JJ. Thank you.
Thanks.
Does it help that the grandma likes reading the book?
Yes, always. Dan, of course.
What, just take that and just edit it? Well, okay, a lot of them people left it. A lot of
hardware, right?
Yeah, he still has.
Pressure on Alan, let's get some hardware. Honestly, I have a bunch of medals and they're all on my desk and I don't know if all, let's, doing the next week when they graduate, I'm like, where are we gonna unearth this?
Yeah, I know, my table,
Really not
covered with
stuff.
stuff. Where is it, like Ryan Walker's?
Thank you.
When he graduated,
Yeah.
his table was
That's cool.
covered with medals and stuff. I was like, oh my gosh.
It would be, yeah, absolutely.
He like, does everything, he does everything well.
Yeah, it's, I haven't been able, just because I've been so busy with everything, I haven't been able to get back into reading since I started writing that book. I am super excited. I was almost done with one of my Brandon Sanderson books. It's like 1,200 pages long or something. And I'm really excited to get back into the game and write that.
Well, I'll read it this summer, I'll get a little copy. Well,
The series that I'm in right now, I was reading the first book that I started the last day of school last year. And I was reading it, it took me about 6 months to actually write the book. But I was kind of slow in reading, it's a really long book, it's like 300 some odd thousand words. And
No, but I mean,
then of course the accident happened, and what was really
Are you a reader? Do
it
you
was like a
it?
dog kind of thing.
Me too.
I
like
was
nonfiction
reading it,
novels,
and
always
the
read
main
nonfiction.
character of the book who I was
I can-
envisioning myself as being.
I can speak to my
Or no,
His girl.
Star Wars, yeah, Star Wars.
I can understand. Yeah, it's like, if you write it down, that's like,
Yeah.
you speak it really fast, I will not